They thought they could judge him by his age and looks, but they were about to learn a lesson they'd never forget. It was an ordinary day in the bustling lobby of one of the city's most prestigious banks. Employees hurried to and fro, catering to wealthy clients and barely sparing a glance at anyone who didn't fit the mold of importance. Then, through the heavy glass doors, stepped a young man, tall, composed, but unmistakably casual in his demeanor. In his hands were crisp documents, held with the confidence of someone on a purposeful errand. This was Barron Trump. But to the bank staff, he was just another kid who didn't belong in their world of polished suits and sky-high egos. He walked up to the reception desk and, with a polite smile, asked for assistance. "Excuse me, I need to deposit these." The receptionist barely looked up. Her eyes darted over his casual clothes, and her lips curled into a smirk. "Deposit these?" she repeated, her tone dripping with skepticism. "Do you even have an account here?" The room grew quieter as a few curious heads turned to watch the interaction. Barron, calm as ever, nodded. "Yes, I do. I need this done today. It's important?" But his words only seemed to amuse the receptionist further. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Important," she scoffed. "Listen, kid, this is a busy bank. We don't have time for whatever this is." Another staff member chimed in from a nearby desk, laughing under his breath. "Maybe try the piggy bank at home." Barron stood his ground, his voice steady but firm. "I'm serious. If you just check my account?" But before he could finish, the manager appeared, drawn by the commotion. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply, his eyes scanning Barron with visible disapproval. "Oh, nothing," the receptionist replied with a dismissive wave. "Just someone wasting our time." The manager's frown deepened. "All right, that's enough," he said. Then, turning to the security guard, he added, "Show him out. We can't have distractions here." Barron's calm demeanor faltered for a moment, but he stepped back, gripping his documents tightly as the guard approached. With a mocking smile, the receptionist added, "Better luck next time, kid." But just as Barron reached the glass doors and the guard prepared to escort him out, the sound of polished shoes echoed through the marble floor behind them. The doors swung open once more, and the room seemed to freeze. In walked Donald Trump, his presence commanding attention like a thunderclap in a silent room. What happened next would leave everyone in the bank stunned, and regretting their decisions just moments earlier. Barron Trump, young, polite, and calm, was on a mission that day, a task handed down by his father. It wasn't just any errand. It involved a significant deposit for a high-priority family project. For Barron, this was more than a routine trip to the bank. It was a moment to show responsibility, and he approached it with the quiet confidence of someone determined to get the job done. But confidence, as Barron would soon find out, meant little to those who judged based on appearances. The manager of the bank was a man who prided himself on status and hierarchy. To him, every customer could be ranked on a scale of worthiness, and anyone outside his perceived elite group was a waste of his time. Barron, in his casual outfit and youthful demeanor, didn't even register as a blip on that scale. And then there was the receptionist, a woman whose sharp tongue and judgmental glances were legendary among her colleagues. As Barron approached the desk, she didn't see the polite young man in front of her. No, all she saw was a teenager who didn't belong in a bank where million-dollar deals were closed daily. With a quick glance, she decided he was irrelevant, and her sarcasm flowed freely. "What can I do for you?" she asked, her voice laced with false politeness. But before Barron could even fully explain his purpose, she shot a glance at her coworker and muttered just loudly enough, "Looks like someone wandered in from the wrong side of town." Barron kept his composure, his voice steady. "I need to make a deposit," he said. "It's important." Important. That word seemed to amuse her. She leaned back in her chair, raising an eyebrow. "Important, huh? Does this important deposit come with an important account? Or are we playing make-believe today?" The receptionist wasn't alone in her attitude. Behind her, a few colleagues had taken notice. One of them chuckled under his breath, whispering to another, "Looks like he's in the wrong place. Should we point him to the nearest toy store?" Barron, undeterred, tried again. "If you check my account, you'll see everything is in order." But the receptionist wasn't interested in checking anything. To her, This was a moment to entertain herself at his expense. She gestured toward the manager, who had just walked in, his expression already annoyed. The manager didn't bother with pleasantries. "What's the problem here?" he asked brusquely, his eyes scanning Barron as if he were some sort of disruption. "No problem," the receptionist replied with a smirk. "Just someone who thinks we're running a kids' club." The manager turned his gaze to Barron. "Look, young man, we're extremely busy. Unless you have legitimate business here, I suggest you move along." Barron stood his ground. "I do have a legitimate business. I need to make this deposit, and it's urgent." But his words fell on deaf ears. The manager dismissed him with a wave. "We don't have time for this," he said. Then, addressing the security guard who had been standing nearby, he added, "Can you escort him out? We can't afford distractions today." The security guard, ever eager to follow orders, stepped forward. "All right, let's go," he said, his tone firm but condescending. Barron tried one last time. "If you just check, you'll see." "That's enough," the manager snapped. "We don't need explanations. This isn't a playground." As Barron was guided toward the exit, he clutched the documents in his hand, determined not to let the humiliation show on his face. "I was sent here by my father," he said quietly, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. The receptionist, overhearing, couldn't resist another jab. "Oh, your father sent you? How cute. Maybe he should have come himself." Little did she know, that's exactly what was about to happen. Outside, just moments away, the very father Barron spoke of was stepping out of a black SUV. And in just a few steps, the staff of this bank would learn that appearances can be deceiving, and that the consequences of their judgment would be unforgettable. As Barron stood there, trying to maintain his composure, he knew he had to make them understand. He wasn't here to play games. He wasn't here to waste anyone's time. The task he had been given was vital, and he needed their cooperation. Yet, as he tried to explain himself, the staff only seemed to grow more amused by his presence. "I need to make a deposit," Barron said, his voice steady. "It's important, and I was asked to take care of this as soon as possible." But the receptionist, still lounging in her chair as if Barron were an inconvenience, let out a loud, mocking laugh. "This isn't a lemonade stand, kid," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. She glanced over at her coworker, who was too busy shaking his head to hide his amusement. Barron's face tightened. He wasn't a kid. He wasn't here to be mocked. He was here to do a job, and he had the right to expect respect. He took a deep breath, trying to keep his cool. "I'm not joking. This is serious." But before he could continue, the manager, the man in charge of this entire operation, stepped in with a disinterested wave of his hand. "We don't have time for pranksters today," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head as if Barron were the one in the wrong. "Some people will do anything for attention." Barron felt the sting of those words, but he refused to let his frustration show. He had been raised to handle situations like this with grace, even when faced with unfair treatment. But just as he was about to try once more to explain the importance of the task at hand, the situation took a turn for the worse. As the exchange continued, other customers in the bank began to notice the tension. They exchanged quick, uncomfortable glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the rude behavior unfolding before them. One older gentleman, sitting at the back of the room, leaned forward in his seat, a sympathetic look in his eyes. "Maybe you should hear the kid out," he suggested to the manager. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of someone who had seen injustice before. "He's not causing trouble." But the manager wasn't interested in hearing any more. He dismissed the customer with a dismissive wave. "We're not running a charity here. This is a bank," he said, his voice dripping with superiority. "We don't have time for distractions." And with that, the humiliation Barron had been trying to avoid began to mount. The manager turned to the security guard, who had been watching silently up until now, and gave a firm order. "Escort him out. We don't need people wasting our time." Barron felt the weight of the words settle in his chest. Wasting their time? He was only here to do something important, something that would have contributed to their business, to their bottom line. Yet here he was, treated like nothing more than a nuisance. As the security guard stepped forward, Barron held up his hands, trying to defuse the situation. "Please, I just need to deposit the funds," he said again, his voice quieter now, almost pleading. But the security guard didn't budge. His eyes were cold, indifferent. "That's enough," the guard said. "Come with me." Barron's heart sank. He had tried. He had remained polite, patient, and respectful. But none of that seemed to matter. And just as he turned toward the door, with the guard's hand on his shoulder, the sound of an approaching vehicle caught his ear. He glanced toward the bank's entrance, the glass doors swaying slightly as a sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb. Barron didn't know it yet, but this was no ordinary car. Inside, his father, Donald Trump, was stepping out, completely unaware of the storm that was about to unfold inside the bank. The staff, oblivious to the impending shift in power, continued with their mockery. They had no idea that the very man they had just insulted was about to be revealed as someone far more important than any of them could have ever imagined. And as Barron stepped toward the exit, trying to regain his composure, he couldn't help but feel the weight of what was coming. This wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. As the door swung open, the atmosphere in the bank shifted in an instant. The subtle hum of conversation, the faint clicking of keyboards, the dull murmur of background noise, all of it disappeared. In his trademark style, Donald Trump strode into the room, exuding a presence that was impossible to ignore. His sharp suit, his confident gait, the very way he carried himself commanded the room's attention. It wasn't just that he was a VIP, he was a force of nature, and his entrance was as imposing as it was inevitable. For a moment, the staff froze. The receptionist, who had been so quick to mock Barron, stared wide-eyed. The manager, who had dismissed the young man with barely a glance, now stood straight as an arrow, his self-assured arrogance faltering for just a second. The security guard, who had been so eager to escort Barron out, shifted uncomfortably. The air in the bank had thickened. What had been a buzzing hive of activity moments before had now turned into a stage, with the staff in the spotlight, unsure of how to react to the sudden shift. But it wasn't the staff who caught Trump's attention first. Outside the bank, Barron had taken a few steps away from the entrance, still reeling from the humiliation he had just endured. He had been kicked out, treated like an outsider. But now, standing on the sidewalk, he wasn't alone. Donald Trump, his father, had spotted him and was already waving him over. Trump's voice rang out, unmistakable and full of authority. "Barron," he called, his tone both commanding and affectionate. Barron looked up, surprised by the sound of his father's voice. He turned, walking toward the door as it swung open to let him back inside. As Barron stepped through, Donald Trump's arm fell casually around his shoulders in an unmistakable gesture of fatherly pride. "This is my son," Trump said firmly, his voice cutting through the stillness in the room. "You might want to remember that." A ripple of gasps spread across the bank, each one more profound than the last. The receptionist's eyes widened. The manager's face drained of color. The security guard, once so confident in his role, now shifted awkwardly on his feet. In that moment, the staff's world seemed to tilt. The young man they had mocked, dismissed, and humiliated was none other than Barron Trump, the son of the very man who had just entered. It didn't take long for them to connect the dots. The arrogant remarks, the ridicule, they had just insulted the son of one of the most powerful men in the world. And now, Donald Trump stood in front of them, silent but expectant. The manager, who had been so quick to dismiss Barron, now found his voice, but it was no longer filled with confidence. "Mr. Trump, he started, but his words were cut off by the weight of the moment. Trump held up a hand, cutting him off with ease. "I'd like to hear what happened here," he said calmly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the staff squirm in their seats. "Explain to me what exactly went on." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. Each one of them knew exactly what had happened, but none of them were prepared for the moment they were now facing. The manager, who had been so dismissive of Barron, now found himself staring at Trump, unsure of how to respond. "Well," Trump's voice was firm but not raised. It wasn't anger that tinged his tone. It was the kind of quiet disappointment that had the power to make anyone, no matter their status, feel small. The receptionist, now fumbling for words, managed to squeak out, "I didn't know, we didn't realize." "No, you didn't realize," Trump replied, his voice crisp and direct. But you judged him based on what? His appearance? His age? His manner? What did you think you were doing? The silence in the room deepened. Each of the staff members now found themselves under the full weight of Trump's gaze, and they could feel the gravity of their actions hanging over them. The manager opened his mouth, but no words came out. Trump didn't need to say anything more. His presence alone was enough to make the staff realize the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about his son being treated unfairly. This was about a larger issue, a matter of respect, of judgment, and of fairness. And in that moment, the staff knew they had crossed a line they couldn't undo. Donald Trump had not just walked into the room. He had walked into their lives, and there was no turning back. The tension in the bank was palpable, every pair of eyes glued to Donald Trump as he stood there, his presence commanding the room with an intensity that left no room for evasion. His gaze swept over the staff, and for the first time, they were forced to meet the reality of their actions. There was no escaping the truth of the situation now, not when Trump was standing before them, not when Barron, the young man they had so cruelly dismissed, was standing by his side. Trump didn't need to raise his voice to make his point. His words were sharp, calculated, and full of authority. "Is this how you treat people?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The question hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Judging by their looks instead of listening? The words stung, and they stung deep. The receptionist, who had mocked Barron's appearance just moments ago, now stood with her head bowed, unable to meet Trump's piercing gaze. The manager, who had been so dismissive, looked like he was shrinking before them. The security guard, who had so eagerly escorted Barron out, stood stiffly, his eyes darting nervously between Trump and the others. Trump's voice didn't waver as he continued. "You've made a dangerous mistake. Underestimating someone because of how they look or how they speak is not only foolish, it's harmful. You never know who someone is, what they're capable of, or the connections they have." The weight of Trump's words was undeniable. It wasn't just a rebuke, it was a lesson in humility, a sharp reminder that appearances could deceive, and that everyone deserved respect. The staff, who had thought they were in control, now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of being the ones who had failed to live up to the basic principle of decency. Barron, who had stood by quietly during the exchange, took a deep breath, his composure unwavering. Despite the humiliation he had faced, despite the way he had been treated, Barron didn't lash out. He didn't harbor anger or resentment. Instead, with a calm that seemed to defy the situation, he stepped forward, looking at the staff with a steady gaze. "I accept your apologies," Barron said, his voice soft but firm. There was no bitterness in his tone, only the grace of someone who understood that people could learn from their mistakes. "We all have moments we regret. I just hope you take this as a lesson to treat others with respect, no matter who they are or how they appear." His words hung in the air, an embodiment of the very lesson Trump had just imparted. Respect and humility were the true measures of a person's character. It was a lesson that the bank staff, who had treated Barron as if he were invisible, now had to confront, whether they liked it or not. But for Trump, this wasn't enough. His sense of justice, his need to stand up for his family, and his unwavering commitment to fairness couldn't be satisfied with a mere apology. "I'll be moving my business accounts elsewhere," he declared, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "No one disrespects my family, or anyone else, like that and gets away with it." The finality in Trump's voice was unmistakable. It wasn't just about the moment. It was about sending a message. A message that actions have consequences, and that disrespect could not and would not be tolerated. And just as quickly as it had all begun, the bank found itself reeling from the fallout. Word spread like wildfire, and soon, customers were pulling out their phones, recording the events that had just unfolded before them. What had started as a moment of humiliation for Barron had now become a moment of reckoning for the bank, and the public wasn't about to let them forget it. Within hours, the incident was all over social media, the bank's reputation taking a nosedive as people shared their outrage over how Barron had been treated. The hashtag #RespectBarron began trending, and countless users shared their own stories of being judged or dismissed based on appearances, creating a wave of support for Barron and a chorus of condemnation for the bank. Outside, reporters had gathered, eager to get their hands on the latest scoop. They thrust microphones in front of Trump, hoping for a soundbite, but it was Barron who took the spotlight. With his father standing beside him, Barron gave a brief, composed statement that encapsulated everything he had learned in that moment. "Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness," Barron said, his voice steady and confident. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a truth, a simple, undeniable truth that resonated with everyone who had witnessed what had just unfolded. And as Barron turned to walk away, the lessons from that day weren't just for the bank staff. They weren't just for those who had recorded the event. They were for everyone who had ever been dismissed, judged, or humiliated based on their appearance. They were for anyone who had ever been made to feel less than, as Barron had been. Because in the end, the message was clear. Kindness, respect, and understanding weren't just things we give others. They were the things that defined us. And the world had just witnessed a powerful reminder of that. As the tension in the room slowly began to dissipate, the staff stood there, their faces a mix of shame and regret. The manager, who had once scoffed at Barron's presence, now found himself fumbling for words. "We're truly sorry," he stammered, his voice devoid of its usual arrogance. "We never should have treated you that way." Beside him, the receptionist who had whispered judgments behind Barron's back also stepped forward, her posture low with embarrassment. I apologize," she said, her voice shaky, her eyes cast downward. "It was wrong of me." The security guard, who had been ready to forcibly escort Barron out of the bank moments earlier, stood silently, nodding in acknowledgement, his face an unreadable mask. There was no defense, no excuse for their actions, and they all knew it. But despite their apologies, Barron remained calm, collected, and unshaken. He had heard their words, but it was clear to everyone that the real lesson wasn't about seeking forgiveness. It was about showing empathy, understanding, and respect in the first place. Then, in a moment that only a father and son could share, Donald Trump turned to Barron, his voice filled with pride and admiration. "You handled that with such grace," Trump said, his voice soft yet firm. "You're stronger than most adults I know." Barron smiled, the weight of the moment not lost on him. His father's words of praise meant more than any apology the bank staff could offer. In that simple exchange, Barron knew that he had learned something far more valuable than just how to handle an embarrassing situation. He had learned the power of dignity, the strength of character, and the importance of standing firm in the face of injustice. And as the two of them turned toward the exit, Trump paused, his gaze shifting toward the bystanders and the lingering staff members who had witnessed everything unfold. With a steady, calm voice, he addressed the room, and perhaps even the world. "Let this be a lesson," Trump said, his tone unwavering. "Never judge a book by its cover. People are more than what you see on the surface. It's what's inside that counts." His words weren't just directed at the staff. They weren't just a reminder for Barron or anyone else in the room. They were a call to action for everyone watching, for everyone who had ever made assumptions based on someone's appearance, and for anyone who had been guilty of judging another too quickly. As the father and son made their way to the door, the staff stood in silence, a profound change slowly taking root within them. And outside, the world had already begun to take note. But before the moment ended, the narrator's voice returned, carrying a message for you, the viewer. Have you ever seen someone judged unfairly? How did it make you feel? What would you have done in that situation? Share your stories in the comments below, because your voice matters. And if you believe, like we do, that kindness and respect are the values that should guide us all, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with others. Let's spread the message and remind the world that it's never too late to treat others with the respect they deserve.